the script because that was reading from. So, Unitarian Universalism is sometimes called the living tradition. You'll see, if we had the gray hymnals out this morning, they're called Singing the Living Tradition. We are open as UUs to growing, changing, and evolving as new evidence, new insights, and new experiences come to light. A more formal way of describing our progressive nature, our progressive orientation, is that we are a theologically liberal religious tradition. In contrast, a theologically conservative religion would tend to resist changing, to resist growing, to resist evolving, even when new facts come to light. Conservatives tend to preserve traditions, social structures, and long-standing community ties that could be put at risk if innovation comes too rapidly. As religious liberals, we UUs are heirs to two heretical religious movements, Unitarianism and Universalism. We're heirs to prophetic figures like Susan B. Anthony, who were unafraid to push the conventions of their day and to innovate. Our ancestors boldly questioned religious traditions that had come to seem obsolete or had come to seem contrary to human reason and human experience. But we UUs are also a big tent. We seek to be inclusive and to draw a wide circle in who is welcome in our congregations. And we're clear that a wide diversity of religious liberals are welcome here. UU Buddhists, UU Christians, UU Humanists, UU Pagans, and more. That being said, on this Sunday, 2 days before Election Day, I would like to invite us to reflect on the ways that despite our wide theological diversity, we're not always as welcoming as we could be to a diversity of political views. Said differently, can you be a religious liberal and a political conservative? Said more provocatively, can you be a Unitarian Universalist and a Republican? There are Republicans within these walls and within this congregation, which you may or may not know, because sometimes I think people tell me they're Republicans, but they don't always feel safe to say that aloud, or that they have that they're complicated, right? That they have views that go on both sides of the political aisles. And as you heard during the spoken meditation, our lack of intentionality around such questions and such dynamics and complexities has resulted in long-time loyal members of our congregations, and I mean that broadly about UU congregations, not just this one, feeling alienated. However, it's not always been the case that theological liberalism, the questioning of traditional religious dogma, was seen to necessitate political liberalism. Consider these words from UU historian Mark Morrison Reed. During the first half of the 20th century, importantly, what that means is prior to McCarthyism, Unitarianism had included outspoken socialists like John Haynes Holmes on one hand, and on the other hand, a strong contingent of Republicans, including former President William Howard Taft, and eventual Supreme Court Justice, and leader of the Unitarian Conference, William Howard Taft, as well as Senator Leverett Saltonstall. On the Universalist side, Clarence Skinner represented the progressive wing, while several congressional representatives also attended Universalist National Memorial Church. Some of them were Dixiecrats. So as early as the first half of the 20th century, it was commonly possible to be a religious liberal and a political conservative. What changed was the 1960s and the 1970s. Morrison Reed writes that civil rights was the first in a series of issues that grew to include the Vietnam War, Black Power, women's liberation, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender liberation movements, environmental concerns, and most recently, immigration rights and reform. These movements reshaped and polarized our American political landscape. Now, I should pause at this point and clarify that by no means am I suggesting that we Unitarian Universalists should be less bold in standing on the side of love for social, economic, and environmental justice. Rather, we should be proud and emboldened by the peace and justice work done by our ancestors like Susan B. Anthony, and that other UUs have done historically and are continuing today. Indeed, the current UUA Common Read, a book selected annually for all UUs to read, discuss, and to act on, is Paul Razor's 2012 book, Reclaiming Prophetic Witness, Liberal Religion in the Public Square. That book laments the ways that too often all of religion has been stereotyped as theologically conservative religion. And Razor's book outlines how our liberal theological heritage can empower and ground our work for peace and justice. If you're interested, I encourage you to read Reclaiming Prophetic Witness. It's short, it's barely more than 100 pages. I'll plan to schedule a sermon and a congregational conversation about it, probably sometime in early 2015. At the same time, I want to take seriously that historically, the theologically liberal traditions of Unitarianism and Universalism have included major figures who were both theologically liberal as well as politically conservative. I also want to take seriously the reflections you heard earlier from that GA workshop, that our big tent of UUism is large enough to reach across the partisan divide that has grown increasingly wide since the 1960s. In so doing, we might be able to build relationships of mutual trust and respect with actual human beings who are complex and far beyond those simple labels of Republican and Democrat. To better understand the roots of the partisanship that has begun to grow deeper in our country since the 1960s, I'd like to turn the clock back even farther to a time of even greater social change that set dynamics that continue to affect us today. The late 18th century, the time of the American Revolution and the time of the French Revolution, which in many ways was the birth of the modern left and right that we know today. As our guide, I'd like to look at a fascinating and really helpful new book that I would recommend to you by Yuval Levin called The Great Debate, Edwin Burke, Thomas Paine, and the Birth of the Left and Right. I first started studying these figures who are the roots of our modern day political movements when I was in college. I took a class called Liberals and Conservatives. So we had to read Burke and read Paine and read John Rawls, who's one of the modern figures that's sort of the new Thomas Paine. For those with a good memory, I also invite you to keep in mind everything that I said about 2 years ago in a similar election sermon based on Jonathan Haidt's important book, The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. I'll link to that sermon in the notes for this sermon if you're interested in going back and looking at that. I would certainly recommend Haidt's book to you. It's excellent and very helpful. Many of you have heard me say before as well that the Latin root of the word liberalism is liber, meaning freedom, and giving us a range of words from liberal to libertarian and a range of connotations from the positive examples like the Statue of Liberty, liberty, that welcomes new immigrants into this land, to negative connotations like a libertine who is irresponsible with freedom. And although liberalism is sometimes seen as a dirty word, when we talk about UUism as a liberal religious tradition, we mean liberal in the best sense of the word. Generous, open to new ideas, open-handed, open-hearted, open-minded, willing to change with new evidence. And the liberal turn in religion is precisely that demand of freedom from religious beliefs and authorities whose only justification is tradition. Liberal religion says that just because we've always done it that way is not sufficient justification to keep believing something and to keep doing something. The liberal turn in religion is likewise not just about freedom from, but about freedom for, exploring wherever human reason and human experience leads us, is what we UUs call our fourth principle, the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. But what happens if that free and responsible search for truth and meaning leads someone to become a Republican? It can and does happen. So what about, and what insights might Paine and Burke, those 18th century luminaries, have for us 21st century religious liberals who want to build a tent big enough to cover even the partisan divide? To begin with Thomas Paine, it's most fitting that his most famous publication is a 50-page pamphlet called Common Sense. Because classic liberalism and the Enlightenment in general is about the turn from history and tradition and alleged one-time divine revelation in the past to universal truths that are apparent and verifiable in all times and places through human reason and human experience. And another word for such universally provable truths is common sense. One major target of Thomas Paine's pen was the hereditary British monarchy, which he saw as opposed to common sense. For Paine, if you just took one step back from those accepted conventions before the American Revolution, the French Revolution, it became self-evident that any one particular allegedly noble family, that they had come to power through some sort of historically contingent circumstances, not delivered from on high, and that those circumstances were usually manipulative, selfish, and often violent. He saw nothing natural about the so-called divine right of kings. Why, he asked, would you want to give perpetual authority to the heirs of someone who lied, cheated, and likely killed their way to power? Even if they came to power for legitimate reasons, why would you assume that that person's children would be the best person to rule, as opposed to just the common sense, letting rule whoever has the best qualities in that generation to rule and to lead? Indeed, history has shown that royal heirs are often corrupt, or at least some generation of. You don't make it many generations before the power corrupts. Instead, Paine argues in his 1791 book, The Rights of Man, that all men are born equal and with equal natural rights. You can hear echoes of those liberal Enlightenment views that inspired Thomas Jefferson and other founders of this nation to throw off the British monarchy and demand that government be based on the consent of the governed. To begin to bring Edmund Burke into the equation, it's fascinating to note that he actually agrees with Paine about the corrupt origins of most monarchies. And they even both agree about the historically contingent and often corrupt origin of most religions. But Burke cautions that we're often unwise to ask those sort of questions. He's like, you're right, but stop asking those questions. We should, in other words, not pull back the curtain and expose that the wonderful Wizard of Oz is actually a mere imperfect mortal. For Burke, we need those illusions built up over time to keep a stable society. Moreover, Burke warns that theorists such as Thomas Paine are naive to put so much trust in human reason, and that they are foolish in their failure to see that that idea of human rights is also historically contingent. It's not handed down from on high. For Burke, it is common sense that humans are ruled much more by their emotions than by their reason. That's something that Jonathan Haidt, in his book, The Righteous Mind, talks about importantly as well. He says we're like the elephant and the rider, that the reason is like a human rider on top of an elephant, and the elephant is our emotions. So that's a much more accurate depiction of our situation. And that human rights are not self-evident, but are rather historically contingent convictions that are built up over time in societies that are humane. In societies that aren't humane, they come to very different conclusions about how one should treat a human. So whereas Paine is in a rush to allow each new generation to tear down past conventions, social conventions, political arrangements, religious beliefs, and rebuild them based on reason and the needs of the present, Burke is concerned that by tearing down traditions and conventions too quickly and too often, what is more likely to result not in reason, compassion, peace, and justice, but rather anarchy, violence, and might makes right. Burke is for social progress, but he is for gradual evolution, whereas Paine is for immediate revolution. Keep in mind that Burke and Paine are writing for the world stage in response to the intense upheaval and violence of the French Revolution, in which king, queen, and other nobility were beheaded in the streets by the newfangled invention known as the guillotine. The equivalent today would be perhaps if the Occupy movement were not setting up tents in Zuccotti Square seeking to remedy our growing wealth inequality, but instead decapitating the wolves of Wall Street and seeking revolution, not evolution. At the same time, when I hear people in power telling marginalized groups, you just need to be patient and we'll gradually grow to more justice, I can't help but hear, in response, Dr. King's challenge in his letter to a Birmingham jail, which he wrote to the white moderates, who are more devoted to order than to justice, who prefer a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly say, well, I agree with you and the goal that you seek, but I just can't agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believe, and Burke was nothing if not paternalistic, who paternalistically believe that you can set the timetable for another human being's freedom. It's so easy for Burke to say, slow down and wait for freedom and equality and justice when you are in a privileged seat in the British House of Commons for decades. Now, overall, my experience of reading Burke and Paine and of reading Levin's book, The Great Debate, is of feeling a pendulum swinging back and forth within me. Because Burke and Paine and the birth of the left and right, they actually aren't a problem to be solved. They're a tension to be managed. They're on two ends of the spectrum. And we need prophets like Thomas Paine calling for liberty and equality now, through revolution, if necessary. But we also need voices like Burke reminding us that we're not merely a collection of rational individuals. Human nature is much more complex than reason alone and much more driven by selfishness and emotion than we normally admit. There are also important values to be found in history and traditions and important obligations that we owe to the common good beyond what is merely in one individual's best interest. And that's what liberals are best at, is affirming the best interest of the individual. But there's more to being human and to human community than that. And just as we intend Unitarian Universalism to be a liberal religious tradition in the best sense of that word liberal, open to new ideas, generous, open-handed, open-hearted, open-minded, there has been room historically, and there is room today within the big tent of Unitarian Universalism for those who are conservative in the best sense of the word. There may not be room for those who are conservative in the worst sense of the word, but there is room for those who are conservative in the best sense of the word, caring about the conservation of nature, upholding the beauty of tradition and rituals which have stood the test of time, reminding us of the importance not only of individual rights and of equality, but of community, authority, sanctity, and loyalty. That dynamic is one reason why many UUs resonate deeply with the contemporary prophets such as Wendell Berry, who are conservative in the best sense of the word. We desperately need such voices in our movement. We Unitarian Universalists like to say that we are standing on the side of love. And wherever you find yourself on the political spectrum this coming election day, as we practice our fifth principle of the democratic process, may you discern within your conscience what it means for you right here and now to vote on the side of love.